The village of Thornfield, which had moments before been preoccupied with the trivial concerns of garden club prizes and summer social obligations, found itself transformed into something resembling a stage set for a particularly melodramatic theatrical production. By the time the local constabulary arrived, which took considerably longer than anyone seemed to think reasonable, given that murder was, after all, not a common occurrence in the Cotswolds. The evening light had begun its slow descent toward dusk, casting long shadows across the manor grounds and lending the proceedings an atmosphere of heightened unreality. Inspector Cullen, a man of approximately 50 years who carried with him the particular weariness of someone who had spent most of his adult life dealing with the consequences of human weakness, established a preliminary examination of the body at Thornfield Lodge's conservatory before conducting the interviews that would, he seemed to believe, rapidly determine the identity of Victoria Ashford's killer. Miss Marple, having remained at the 50 grounds even as the garden club's members dispersed, made her way with quiet dignity to the manor house, where the Ashford family had gathered in the drawing room. She was not, strictly speaking, invited to do so, but her long residence in the village and her genuine friendship with Mrs. Ashford, Victoria's mother, provided sufficient excuse for her presence, and no one possessed the discourtesy to suggest that she depart.
The drawing room itself seemed to shrink around the 5 people assembled within it. Mrs. Ashford, who sat rigid upon a sofa with the expression of someone who had been informed that the world's basic operating principles had been fundamentally altered, Timothy, who paced near the window with the jerky, interrupted movements of a man attempting to manage shock through physical activity, Mr. Ashford, who occupied a leather wingback chair and appeared to be engaged in the process of aging several years within the space of a few hours, Anne Hartwell, Victoria's closest friend since childhood, who sat beside Mrs. Ashford with her hand gripping that lady's arm as though afraid that without such physical contact...
It was David who drew Miss Marple's immediate attention, though she gave no indication of doing so. He stood slightly apart from the others, near the fireplace, and his hands trembled in a manner that suggested either genuine distress or something that might be mistaken for it by persons not accustomed to observing the subtle distinctions between authentic emotion and its carefully constructed imitation. His face bore the pallor of shock, certainly, but there was about him a quality of disconnection, as though part of his attention remained focused on some internal calculation of considerable importance. Inspector Cullen arrived approximately 20 minutes after Miss Marple had seated herself in a corner chair with a cup of tea that no one had thought to bring her, but which had materialized nonetheless through the efficient machinations of the Ashfords' housekeeper. The inspector was not, Miss Marple reflected, a particularly imaginative man. He possessed the sort of orderly mind that functioned well within established procedures and predetermined categories of criminal behavior. He would, she suspected, approach this matter much as he approached all matters, by identifying the most obvious suspect, establishing motive and opportunity, and then constructing a narrative framework into which he could place the available evidence until it fit with satisfactory neatness. Such an approach was frequently effective, particularly when one was dealing with crimes of passion or simple greed. However, Miss Marple had long ago learned that human motivation rarely functioned with the mechanical precision that official investigators seemed to expect of it. The inspector began by establishing basic facts. Victoria had been discovered in the conservatory at Thornfield Lodge at approximately 4:25 in the afternoon. Death appeared to have occurred somewhere between 3 o'clock and 3:45, based on the preliminary examination of the body. The poison, which the inspector was somewhat circumspect in discussing, appeared to be something relatively exotic, not the sort of substance one acquired without considerable forethought and knowledge. This last detail seemed to animate the inspector, who appeared to believe that such specificity would narrow the field of suspects considerably. He asked, in his methodical fashion, about Victoria's movements that afternoon, her relationships with the assembled persons, and whether anyone present had noticed anything unusual about her behavior or demeanor. The answers, as they came, painted a portrait of a young woman who had seemed perfectly normal that morning, who had attended the 50 at her mother's insistence, and who had, according to Anne Hartwell, mentioned only that she needed to speak with someone privately regarding a matter of some delicacy. David Carlyle, when directly questioned about the nature of his relationship with Victoria, became noticeably more uncomfortable. He acknowledged the courtship, the implicit understanding that their connection would likely develop toward marriage within the next year or two, but he became evasive when asked about any recent disagreements or tensions. His hands continued their subtle trembling, and Miss Marple, watching from her corner with the apparent focus of someone engaged in needlework, observed that his eyes moved frequently toward the door, as though calculating whether escape might be possible or advisable. By the time the inspector concluded his initial questioning and indicated that he would require more detailed statements from each person on the following day, darkness had settled entirely over Thornfield. The evening had become the sort that inspired reflection on mortality and the fragility of the social structures that held communities together. Miss Marple accepted a ride home from Mr. Ashford, who seemed to require the activity of performing some small courtesy as a mechanism for processing his grief. During the drive, she said very little, but she thought a great deal about David Carlyle's trembling hands and the particular quality of disconnection that had characterized his expression. She thought, too, about what Anne Hartwell had said regarding Victoria's need to speak with someone privately about a matter of delicacy. And she began, in the quiet fashion that was characteristic of her approach to mysteries, to ask herself not who had killed Victoria Ashford, but rather why. The morning following Victoria's death arrived with a sort of indifferent brightness that suggested the world had not in fact paused to acknowledge the tragedy that had befallen one of its inhabitants. The sun rose over Thornfield much as it had risen on countless other mornings, illuminating the stone cottages and manicured gardens with a light that seemed almost obscene in its cheerfulness. Miss Marple, who had slept remarkably well, despite the preceding evening's dramatic events, rose at her customary hour and engaged in her morning routine with the methodical precision that had characterized her days for the better part of 7 decades. She consumed a modest breakfast, attended to her correspondence, and then settled herself in her small sitting room with a cup of tea and the village newsletter, a publication that Mrs. Proctor edited with the sort of meticulous attention to detail that suggested she believed every social detail of Thornfield's residence to be worthy of permanent documentation. By mid-morning, however, Miss Marple found herself drawn toward the village centre, where the news of Victoria's murder had apparently reached even those residents who had not attended the Garden 50. The postmistress, Mrs. Benton, seemed particularly animated in her discussion of the matter, sharing with anyone who entered the post office her theories regarding the identity and motivation of the killer. According to Mrs. Benton, who had developed her information-gathering skills over approximately 30 years of examining every piece of correspondence that passed through her hands, David Carlyle had been observed in the company of a woman from the neighboring county on no fewer than 3 occasions in the preceding month. This woman, described variously as stylish, ambitious, and decidedly unmarried despite being well into her 30s, had apparently engaged young Mr. Carlyle in conversations of considerable intensity. Mrs. Benton had naturally observed this development with the interested attention it deserved, and she had mentioned her observations to several other persons, including the vicar's wife and old Mr. Hartwell's housekeeper. The implications, Mrs. Benton suggested with the delicate precision of someone who understood the power of unspoken insinuation, were rather obvious. If young David had been conducting a courtship with another woman while maintaining his understanding with Victoria, then Victoria might well have discovered this infidelity, and the subsequent confrontation might have resulted in precisely the sort of tragedy that had befallen her. Miss Marple listened to this narrative with the expression of polite interest that she habitually wore when engaged in village conversation. She made several small comments that suggested agreement with Mrs. Benton's reasoning, while actually committing herself to nothing whatsoever. She purchased a postage stamp that she did not particularly require and withdrew from the post office with her handbag and her thoughts intact. The theory regarding David Carlyle's infidelity, she reflected as she made her way toward the village green, possessed the virtue of simplicity. It also possessed the considerable disadvantage of being almost certainly incomplete, if not entirely inaccurate. She had observed, during the previous evening's conversations, that David's distress seemed to contain an element of shock, the sort of shock that suggested he had not anticipated the outcome he had presumably engineered. A man who had murdered his fiancée, even in a moment of passionate anger, would likely display remorse, anger, or desperation. David Carlyle had displayed something else entirely. The appearance of someone whose careful plans had somehow achieved an entirely unexpected conclusion. By the time Miss Marple had completed her circuit of the village and returned to her cottage, the police had apparently made their first significant advancement in the case. Inspector Collin had requested that several persons present themselves at the manor house for more extensive questioning, a development that set the village gossip machinery in motion with renewed vigor. Among those summoned were David Carlyle, Anne Hartwell, Timothy Ashford, and, somewhat surprisingly to many observers, old Mr. Hartwell himself. The timing of these summonses seemed deliberate, suggesting that the inspector had, through some mechanism of investigation that remained opaque to the village at large, identified certain individuals as worthy of more intensive scrutiny. Miss Marple learned of these developments through the efficient transmission of village information networks. Mrs. Hudson, who served as housekeeper to the vicar and who possessed the remarkable ability to be present in multiple locations simultaneously through the simple expedient of attending to her duties throughout the parish, mentioned to the grocer's wife that she had observed the police arriving at the manor at approximately 11 o'clock. The grocer's wife, having received this information while arranging vegetables in her shop window, mentioned it to the butcher when he arrived to collect his daily orders. By early afternoon, most of Thornfield had become aware that the investigation was proceeding along lines that involved not merely David Carlyle, but several other prominent residents of the village. It was at this juncture that Miss Marple took herself to the gardens of the manor, where she had been invited by Mrs. Ashford. Or rather, where she had invited herself through the simple mechanism of arriving with a batch of homemade biscuits and the gentle suggestion that she might sit with Mrs. Ashford for a time. As that lady appeared to be rather in need of companionship, Mrs. Ashford, who had aged visibly in the space of 24 hours, received her with gratitude and apparent relief. The two women settled themselves in the morning room, and Miss Marple listened as Mrs. Ashford described, with a mother's particular anguish, the complicated nature of her daughter's recent emotional life. Victoria, it emerged, had been considerably more troubled by matters than her parents had initially understood. She had, in the weeks preceding her death, become distant, distracted, and occasionally prone to tears that she had attempted to conceal from her family. When Mrs. Ashford had asked about the source of her daughter's unhappiness, Victoria had insisted that nothing was wrong, merely that she was experiencing the usual minor frustrations of a young woman navigating the expectations of her family and society. However, Mrs. Ashford had observed certain details that suggested the matter was considerably more serious than her daughter had admitted. Victoria had received letters from an unknown correspondent, letters that she had concealed in her desk and that she had read with the sort of intensity that suggested they contained information of significant emotional weight. Miss Marple, absorbing this revelation with the apparent casualness of someone simply conversing with a friend, found herself beginning to perceive the outline of a narrative considerably more complex than the simple tale of romantic infidelity that Mrs. Benton had so confidently proposed. The morning room in which Miss Marple and Mrs. Ashford sat possessed that particular quality of English domestic comfort that seemed to insulate its occupants from the harsh realities of the outside world, though in this case the insulation appeared decidedly inadequate to the task. Soft afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains, illuminating the watercolors on the walls and the various small ornaments that Mrs. Ashford had collected over the course of a long and materially comfortable life. Yet the room's usual atmosphere of pleasant gentility had been entirely displaced by a quality of profound unease. Mrs. Ashford, having begun her disclosure regarding Victoria's mysterious correspondence, seemed to find in the act of confession a certain relief from the burden of her knowledge. She rose from her chair and moved toward the writing desk in the corner of the room, from which she extracted a small bundle of letters tied with a pale blue ribbon. These, she explained with the diffident manner of someone sharing information that she felt somewhat guilty for possessing, were the letters that Victoria had received over the course of the preceding 2 months. They had arrived at irregular intervals, and Victoria had taken considerable care to conceal them from her parents, disposing of the envelopes and keeping only the letters themselves, which she had hidden beneath the lining of her stationery box. Mrs. Ashford, discovering them only the previous day while engaged in the melancholy task of sorting her daughter's belongings, had not yet revealed their existence to her husband or to Inspector Cullen. The letters, Miss Marple observed as she examined them with careful attention, were written in a hand that suggested education and considerable emotional agitation. The author, who had signed himself only as H, appeared to be engaged in some form of emotional appeal directed toward Victoria, though the precise nature of the matter to which he referred remained, on the surface of the text, somewhat obscure. There were repeated references to what we discussed, the situation that has become impossible, and the necessity of making a decision that will affect us both. One passage, dated approximately 3 weeks prior, contained language that struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. "I understand that you feel bound by duty and by the expectations of your family. But surely you must recognize that the pretense cannot continue indefinitely. When the truth emerges, and it will emerge, Victoria, whether we choose to reveal it or not, the consequences will be far more severe than they would be if we took control of the narrative ourselves." Miss Marple, reading these words with the attention they clearly deserved, felt the first genuine stirring of clarity regarding the nature of Victoria's death. The murder had not been, she suspected, the result of simple romantic jealousy or even financial desperation. It appeared to be something more calculated, more deliberate, and possibly more terrible in its implications. She returned the letters to Mrs. Ashford with the suggestion that this correspondence should be immediately conveyed to Inspector Cullen, a recommendation that Mrs. Ashford received with visible distress. The revelation of such letters, Mrs. Ashford pointed out with the particular anxiety of a mother, would inevitably suggest that Victoria had been engaged in some form of inappropriate relationship, a circumstance that would not only damage her reputation posthumously, but would also raise questions regarding her family's judgment and character. Miss Marple acknowledged this concern with genuine sympathy while maintaining her position that concealing evidence from the police investigation would ultimately prove far more damaging than honest disclosure. It was at this moment that Timothy Ashford entered the morning room, having apparently concluded his interview with Inspector Cullen. The young man bore the appearance of someone who had been subjected to intensive scrutiny and who had found the experience significantly more unpleasant than anticipated. His usually composed expression had been replaced by something approaching agitation, and his eyes possessed the slightly hunted quality of someone aware that suspicion had fallen upon him, however unjustly he might believe such suspicion to be. Mrs. Ashford immediately rose and moved toward her son, but Timothy gestured that she should remain seated. He turned toward Miss Marple with an expression that suggested he had suddenly become aware of her presence in the room, and was uncertain whether to be grateful for her involvement in family matters or resentful of her intrusion into circumstances that seemed to him decidedly private. It was Timothy who provided Miss Marple with the next significant piece of information, though he did so reluctantly and only after his mother had pressed him regarding the nature of the inspector's questioning. Victoria, Timothy revealed with obvious reluctance, had been engaged in some form of confidential correspondence with someone whose identity she had been unwilling to disclose. She had mentioned to Timothy approximately 1 week prior that she was facing a situation of considerable personal difficulty, and that she needed to make a decision that would have far-reaching consequences for her future. When Timothy had pressed her for details, Victoria had simply stated that the matter was not his concern, and that she would prefer that no one in the family interfere until she had resolved matters according to her own judgment. Timothy had naturally mentioned this conversation to no one, as he had assumed that Victoria was dealing with some minor romantic complication that would resolve itself through the ordinary passage of time. However, now that Victoria was dead and the police were questioning him with an intensity that suggested they considered him a potential suspect, Timothy was beginning to wonder whether he should have taken his sister's cryptic warnings more seriously. Miss Marple asked, with the apparent casualness of someone simply making conversation, whether Timothy had any notion regarding the identity of the person with whom Victoria had been corresponding. Timothy hesitated, and in that hesitation, Miss Marple perceived the operation of his conscience wrestling with his inclination toward discretion. Finally, he admitted that he had formed a suspicion, though he possessed no concrete evidence. Approximately 4 months prior, their father had hired a new estate manager, a man named Henry Whitmore, who had previously been employed in a similar capacity at several other large properties. Whitmore was competent, efficient, and had earned their father's considerable respect through his management of the manor's extensive holdings. However, Timothy had observed, on several occasions, Victoria and Whitmore engaged in what appeared to be intense private conversations. On one occasion, he had encountered them in the library late in the evening, and they had separated hastily upon his entrance, suggesting that they had not wished to be observed in each other's company. Timothy had thought nothing of it at the time, attributing the matter to simple courtesy regarding estate business that Victoria might have been assisting with. Now, however, he wondered whether the matter had been considerably more complicated. The revelation regarding Henry Whitmore seemed to settle over the morning room like a fog, altering the entire landscape of understanding that had previously existed regarding Victoria's death. Miss Marple, who had maintained her position in the comfortable chair with the patient attention of someone accustomed to allowing others to arrive at conclusions through their own processes of reasoning, allowed a moment of silence to pass before posing the question that Timothy's disclosure had inevitably raised. She asked, with genuine curiosity, whether Timothy had mentioned his observations regarding Victoria and Mr. Whitmore to Inspector Cullen during the course of their interview. Timothy's expression suggested that he had not, and moreover that the question itself had introduced an element of complication into his consciousness that he would have preferred to avoid. He explained, with the defensive tone of someone justifying a decision that he recognized might be criticized, that his observations had been fragmentary and entirely circumstantial. To have mentioned them to the police would have been to suggest impropriety on his sister's part, without possessing any concrete evidence that such impropriety had actually occurred. Moreover, Mr. Whitmore was a valued employee of the family, and Timothy's father had expressed considerable confidence in his abilities and character. To introduce suspicion regarding such a man based solely on Timothy having observed him in conversation with Victoria seemed to Timothy to constitute an unwarranted and potentially damaging intrusion into matters that might have entirely innocent explanations. Mrs. Ashford, who had been listening to this exchange with increasing distress, finally intervened to point out that if Mr. Whitmore had indeed been engaged in some form of improper relationship with Victoria, and if Victoria had subsequently threatened to reveal this relationship, then Mr. Whitmore possessed precisely the sort of motive that would explain her murder. The reasoning was sound, though it failed to account for several details that Miss Marple found herself considering. She asked Timothy whether he had observed any indication that Victoria had been attempting to sever her relationship with Mr. Whitmore, or conversely, whether she had appeared to be increasingly entangled in whatever connection existed between them. Timothy reflected on this question with the appearance of someone attempting to retrieve memories that he had not consciously examined. He recalled that Victoria's demeanor regarding the matter seemed to have shifted approximately 1 month prior. In the weeks preceding this shift, she had appeared animated and energized by her interactions with Mr. Whitmore, frequently appearing distracted during family meals and exhibiting the sort of suppressed excitement that suggested she was engaged in contemplating matters of considerable personal significance. However, beginning approximately 4 weeks ago, this animation had gradually been replaced by something approaching despair. She had become withdrawn, had stopped attempting to conceal her emotional state, and had begun to display the sort of quiet anguish that their mother had observed but had attributed to romantic complications with David Carlyle. Miss Marple, absorbing these chronological details, found herself beginning to perceive the outlines of a narrative considerably more intricate than a simple case of illicit romance followed by murder. The letter signed H, presumably Henry Whitmore, had referenced the necessity of making a decision that will affect us both, and had indicated that when the truth emerges, the consequences will be far more severe. This language suggested not merely a romantic entanglement, but rather a situation in which Victoria possessed information or had made discoveries that had created complications requiring resolution. She suggested to Mrs. Ashford that the letters should indeed be conveyed to Inspector Cullen with the additional information that Timothy had just provided regarding Mr. Whitmore. However, she added, it might be advisable to first allow her to make certain inquiries of her own regarding Mr. Whitmore's background and history, as such information might provide context that would render the inspector's investigation considerably more efficient. Mrs. Ashford, though appearing conflicted regarding the propriety of allowing an amateur to engage in investigative activities, seemed to find reassurance in Miss Marple's apparent confidence in her own abilities. She agreed to delay disclosure of the letters for a period of 24 hours, during which Miss Marple would endeavor to gather preliminary information. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple had established herself at the village library, where she had engaged in conversation with the librarian, a remarkably well-informed woman named Miss Collins, who possessed access to periodicals and reference materials that extended considerably beyond what one might expect to find in a small village institution. Through a combination of apparently casual inquiry and genuine intellectual interest, Miss Marple had ascertained that Henry Whitmore had indeed been employed at several properties over the preceding 15 years, though his tenure at each had been notably brief. He had departed from his previous position, according to references that had been provided to Mr. Ashford, under circumstances that had been described as mutually agreeable, but that, upon closer examination through Miss Collins' extensive network of acquaintances in neighboring villages, appeared to have involved some form of scandal or indiscretion that had never been entirely clarified. In one case, a young woman employed as a governess had departed from the estate shortly after Mr. Whitmore's arrival, and her subsequent location had become a matter of considerable local speculation. In another instance, the landowner had been obliged to make certain financial settlements that had been characterized as relating to agricultural disputes, though the precise nature of these disputes had remained remarkably unclear. By the time Miss Marple left the library as evening began to settle over Thornfield, she had formed preliminary conclusions regarding Henry Whitmore that suggested a pattern of behavior that extended considerably beyond the bounds of simple romantic indiscretion. She had also begun to suspect that Victoria's death might have resulted not from a single moment of passionate violence, but rather from a carefully calculated resolution to a situation that had become, from Mr. Whitmore's perspective, increasingly threatening. The evening of Miss Marple's library consultation found her engaged in a solitary dinner at her cottage, during which she engaged in the particular form of contemplative thinking that had, over the course of her lifetime, frequently resulted in the clarification of matters that seemed obscure to others. She consumed her soup with mechanical precision, while her mind engaged itself with the various pieces of information she had gathered, attempting to arrange them into patterns that might illuminate the fundamental question of why Victoria Ashford had been murdered, and by whom. The conventional theory, which Inspector Cullen appeared to be pursuing with steadfast determination, focused upon David Carlyle as the prime suspect. The evidence supporting this theory was circumstantial but possessed a certain superficial coherence. David had been engaged to Victoria. He had apparently been conducting an alternative courtship with another woman. Victoria might have discovered this infidelity, and the confrontation that would have inevitably followed could have resulted in his administering poison to silence her accusations. However, Miss Marple found this narrative unconvincing for reasons that she had difficulty articulating, but that seemed to her to be nonetheless compelling. David's trembling hands and his expression of disconnection suggested surprise rather than guilt. His distress appeared to stem from shock rather than from the remorse or desperation that would characterize a man who had just murdered his fiancée in a moment of passion. Moreover, the poison employed in Victoria's death was not the sort of substance that would be readily available to a young country gentleman whose experience with such matters would be limited to occasional exposure through general education. By contrast, Henry Whitmore possessed the sort of background that suggested access to knowledge that would be required to procure and administer such a substance. He had traveled extensively, had been employed in positions of considerable responsibility, and possessed the sort of professional competence that would extend to practical chemistry or pharmacology. More importantly, if Miss Marple's preliminary conclusions regarding his pattern of behavior were accurate, he possessed the sort of character that would regard obstacles to his objectives as problems requiring resolution through whatever means available. Miss Marple was interrupted in these reflections by the arrival of Anne Hartwell, Victoria's childhood friend, who appeared at her cottage door with the appearance of someone who had engaged in considerable internal debate before deciding to seek Miss Marple's counsel. Anne, entering the sitting room with an uncertainty that contrasted sharply with her usually confident demeanor, seemed to be wrestling with competing loyalties and obligations. Miss Marple, perceiving this conflict with her customary acuity, invited the young woman to sit and offered her tea, a beverage that Anne accepted with gratitude, despite having apparently been in a state of considerable emotional agitation that suggested tea was the last thing she required. It was Anne who provided Miss Marple with the crucial information that would transform her preliminary suspicions into something approaching certainty. She had come, Anne explained, because she possessed knowledge regarding Victoria's situation that she had initially believed she should conceal out of loyalty to her departed friend, but which she now recognized that she had a moral obligation to disclose. Victoria, it emerged, had not been engaged in a romantic relationship with Henry Whitmore, though she had certainly been alone with him on numerous occasions and had appeared to find his company compelling. Rather, Victoria had discovered something regarding Mr. Whitmore that had filled her with a complex mixture of emotions, including sympathy, indignation, and ultimately a sense of moral responsibility that had compelled her to action. Approximately 4 months prior, Victoria had accidentally discovered that Henry Whitmore had a daughter, a young woman of approximately 20 years of age, who was being maintained in a cottage on the opposite side of the county through financial arrangements that Mr. Whitmore had established. This daughter was the result of Mr. Whitmore's relationship with a woman he had employed as a governess at a previous position approximately 20 years prior. An arrangement that had resulted in the birth of a child and the subsequent departure of the governess from the household under circumstances that had been attributed to her having obtained other employment. Anne explained that Victoria had become deeply invested in the circumstances of this young woman's life, and had gradually developed the conviction that Mr. Whitmore had a moral obligation to acknowledge his daughter and to provide her with the sort of legitimate social position that her circumstances warranted. She had begun to advocate with increasing intensity that Mr. Whitmore either formally acknowledge the relationship or provide sufficient financial resources to permit his daughter to establish herself in a respectable manner. Mr. Whitmore had apparently resisted these suggestions with increasing firmness, arguing that to acknowledge such a relationship would constitute an admission of the impropriety that had created it and would inevitably result in social consequences that would damage his reputation and professional standing. This disagreement had apparently intensified approximately 1 month prior, when Victoria had informed Mr. Whitmore of her intention to discuss the matter with her father, and to suggest that the Ashford family might be in a position to assist in establishing the young woman in a more respectable situation. It was at this point, Anne indicated, that Mr. Whitmore's demeanor had undergone a marked alteration. He had become withdrawn, had reduced the frequency of his conversations with Victoria and had appeared to be engaged in some form of internal calculation of considerable importance. 2 weeks prior, Victoria had confided to Anne that she feared Mr. Whitmore might attempt to leave his position at the manor and relocate to a distant location, thereby removing himself from the possibility of her continued advocacy on behalf of his daughter. Victoria had therefore determined that she would bring the matter to her father's attention immediately, without further consultation with Mr. Whitmore, in the hopes that her father's intervention might convince Mr. Whitmore that concealment of the relationship was no longer a viable option. Miss Marple, listening to this narrative with the utmost attention, felt the final pieces of the puzzle settling into place with a clarity that was almost disturbing in its precision. Victoria had not been murdered because of romantic jealousy or because of exposure of an affair. She had been murdered because she had represented an obstacle to Mr. Whitmore's preservation of his carefully constructed social position and professional reputation. The revelation that Anne Hartwell had provided seemed to reorient Miss Marple's understanding of the entire matter with the precision of a compass needle returning to true north. She set down her teacup with deliberate care and regarded the young woman with an expression of such penetrating sympathy that Anne appeared to experience a simultaneous sensation of relief and additional distress. Miss Marple thanked Anne for her courage in coming forward, and she assured the young woman that the information she had provided would prove instrumental in clarifying the circumstances of Victoria's death. She suggested, however, that Anne should herself convey this information to Inspector Cullen on the following morning, as such a disclosure coming directly from Victoria's closest friend would carry considerably more weight than if it were reported through intermediaries. Anne, having unburdened herself of the knowledge that had apparently been weighing upon her conscience, departed Miss Marple's cottage with a visible lightening of her emotional state, though she remained troubled by the recognition that her disclosure would inevitably result in the revelation of Victoria's intimate concerns to the official machinery of police investigation. By the time Anne had departed and Miss Marple found herself once again alone with her thoughts, the evening had progressed toward that hour, when the village of Thornfield became notably quieter, as its residents withdrew into their homes and engaged in whatever private activities occupied their evenings. Miss Marple, however, found herself unable to settle into her customary evening routine of needlework and quiet reflection. Instead, she occupied herself with composing a lengthy letter to Inspector Cullen, in which she outlined with careful precision the various pieces of information that had come to her attention regarding Henry Whitmore's history, his character, and his likely motivation for eliminating an obstacle to his continued comfortable existence. She was careful to frame her observations not as accusations, but rather as suggestions regarding directions that his investigation might profitably pursue. The letter was completed by approximately 10:30 in the evening, and Miss Marple allowed herself to retire to bed with the satisfaction of someone who had discharged her obligation to illuminate matters that had been shrouded in confusion. The following morning brought with it developments that suggested that Miss Marple's letter had achieved its intended effect. Inspector Cullen, arriving at her cottage at an unseemly early hour, displayed the sort of barely concealed agitation that suggested he had experienced a significant alteration in his investigative focus. He was accompanied by 2 constables, and his demeanor suggested that he had come not merely to gather information, but rather to provide Miss Marple with information regarding developments that she would presumably find of considerable interest. Henry Whitmore had apparently absconded during the previous night. He had apparently collected various personal possessions from the cottage he occupied as part of his employment at the manor, had withdrawn a substantial sum of money from his bank account, and had apparently departed the village in the direction of the coast, where it was suspected he intended to secure passage on a vessel traveling to continental Europe. His disappearance had only been discovered when Mr. Ashford had attempted to consult with him regarding estate business that morning, and had found his cottage empty and his employment apparently concluded without any communication regarding his departure. Inspector Collins seemed to regard this disappearance as constituting something approaching a confession. He explained to Miss Marple that the information she had provided, combined with the disclosure that Anne Hartwell had made regarding Victoria's intention to force acknowledgement of Mr. Whitmore's illegitimate daughter, had persuaded him that Whitmore possessed the precise combination of motive and access that would explain the crime. Moreover, the fact that Whitmore had fled suggested consciousness of guilt. The inspector seemed somewhat surprised when Miss Marple expressed the opinion that while Whitmore's disappearance certainly indicated his involvement in Victoria's death, it did not necessarily indicate the precise mechanism by which he had accomplished the murder. Miss Marple suggested that Inspector Collins might profitably examine the question of how Whitmore had gained access to the poison that had been employed in Victoria's death, and moreover, how he had managed to administer it to Victoria without her knowledge or suspicion. She further suggested that Whitmore's flight might have resulted not from panic regarding his crime being discovered, but rather from his recognition that the investigation was advancing in directions that threatened to expose information he had gone to considerable lengths to conceal. By midday, the constabulary had established that Henry Whitmore had indeed boarded a vessel at Bristol, bound for France. Telegraphic communication had been initiated with continental authorities regarding his apprehension, though the likelihood of his successful capture seemed, to Miss Marple's assessment, considerably lower than Inspector Collins appeared to believe. What seemed more probable was that Whitmore had engineered his disappearance with the sort of careful planning that would permit him to establish a new identity in a location where his previous history would remain unknown. By evening, the village of Thornfield had become consumed with the excitement and satisfaction that typically accompanies the apparent resolution of a mystery that had disturbed the peace of an ordinarily tranquil community. Inspector Collins had publicly identified Whitmore as the primary suspect in Victoria's murder, and the consensus of village opinion had swiftly aligned itself with this conclusion. Miss Marple, however, found herself engaged in a process of careful reflection regarding certain aspects of the case that seemed to her to remain inadequately explained. She thought, in particular, about the chronology of events and about the precise manner in which Victoria had been induced to consume the poison that had resulted in her death. She thought as well about the letters signed with the initial H and about the particular emotional tone they had conveyed, and she began, with the slow certainty that characterized all of her investigative conclusions, to suspect that the case was considerably more complex than either the police or the village at large had yet recognized. The afternoon following Inspector Collins' confirmation that Henry Whitmore was the primary suspect in Victoria's murder found Miss Marple engaged in what might have appeared to a casual observer to be nothing more than a pleasant social visit to the manor house. She had provided Mrs. Ashford with the excuse that she wished to inquire regarding that lady's emotional state and to offer whatever comfort and companionship that her presence might provide. Mrs. Ashford, grateful for the support, had welcomed her with the kind of genuine relief that suggested she found in Miss Marple's presence something approaching emotional sanctuary. However, Miss Marple's visit possessed an additional purpose that she had not articulated to Mrs. Ashford or to anyone else. She had come to the manor house with the specific intention of examining certain aspects of the physical circumstances surrounding Victoria's death that had not been adequately clarified through the ordinary channels of police investigation. With Mrs. Ashford's permission, she had requested to examine Victoria's bedroom, ostensibly to confirm that the young woman's personal effects had been treated with appropriate respect and care. In Victoria's bedroom, which had been preserved essentially as it had existed at the moment of her death, Miss Marple engaged in a careful and methodical examination of the various objects that comprised the young woman's immediate environment. She observed the arrangement of the writing desk, the contents of the wardrobe, the books that lined the shelves, and the various small ornaments that decorated the room. It was in the drawer of the bedside table that she made a discovery of considerable significance. A small glass vial, approximately 3/4 full of a clear liquid, concealed behind the drawer's false bottom. She removed this vial with considerable care, sealed it within a handkerchief, and returned the drawer to its original position. Miss Marple did not immediately examine the contents of the vial, nor did she reveal its existence to anyone. Instead, she thanked Mrs. Ashford for the opportunity to visit, assured her that Victoria's room had been treated with appropriate respect, and departed the manor house with the vial secured within her handbag. By the time she had returned to her cottage, evening was beginning to settle over the village, and Miss Marple found herself facing a question that demanded resolution. If Henry Whitmore had administered poison to Victoria, what was the purpose of the vial she had discovered concealed in Victoria's bedroom? The logical conclusion suggested itself with uncomfortable insistence. The vial had not belonged to Henry Whitmore. It belonged to Victoria herself. This realization necessitated a fundamental reconsideration of the entire narrative that had apparently been established regarding Victoria's death. If Victoria had possessed poison and had concealed it in her bedroom, then either she had intended to use it for purposes that remained unclear, or alternatively someone else had deliberately placed it there subsequent to her death for reasons that demanded explanation. Miss Marple spent the greater part of the evening engaged in careful consideration of this possibility. She retrieved Victoria's letters from Mrs. Ashford, whom she had requested hold them temporarily, and she engaged in a meticulous rereading of the communication signed with the initial H. The tone of the letters suddenly presented itself to her in an entirely altered light. The references to the necessity of making a decision that will affect us both and to when the truth emerges no longer seemed to be the communications of a man attempting to silence a woman who threatened to expose his secrets. Rather, they appeared to be the desperate attempts of someone to convince another person to refrain from a course of action that both of them recognized would result in catastrophic consequences. By the following morning, Miss Marple had reached a conclusion that seemed to her to explain with remarkable coherence all of the otherwise inexplicable details of the case. She requested an audience with Inspector Collin, a meeting that she was granted with some degree of reluctance, as the inspector appeared to believe that the essential facts of the matter had been established, and that further investigation would constitute a waste of official resources now that the primary suspect had fled the jurisdiction. However, Miss Marple presented to him the vial that she had discovered, and she suggested that a careful analysis of its contents would prove illuminating regarding certain aspects of the case that had been inadequately explained. She further suggested that the inspector might profitably redirect his investigation toward examining the possibility that Victoria's death, rather than being the result of Henry Whitmore's deliberate administration of poison, had resulted from Victoria's own consumption of a substance that she had deliberately obtained and concealed. The inspector, who displayed considerable skepticism regarding this suggestion, nonetheless agreed to submit the vial for chemical analysis. The results, which arrived approximately 48 hours later, confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion with precision that was almost terrible in its implications. The vial contained arsenic, a substance that could be obtained through legitimate chemical suppliers with relative ease by anyone willing to provide a plausible explanation for its acquisition. Analysis of Victoria's bodily tissues indicated that the poison that had resulted in her death was of precisely the same composition and concentration as the arsenic contained within the vial. This discovery necessitated a complete reorientation of the police investigation. Henry Whitmore's flight had not been the result of his having murdered Victoria. It had resulted from his discovery that Victoria had apparently attempted to end her own life, and his recognition that his presence at the manor and his relationship with Victoria would inevitably be examined with the sort of intense scrutiny that would expose the secrets he had attempted so carefully to conceal. The question that now demanded resolution was considerably more complicated and more tragic than the straightforward matter of murder. It was the question of why Victoria Ashford, a young woman possessed of every apparent advantage, had apparently decided that death was preferable to continuing her existence. The revelation that Victoria Ashford's death had resulted from her own deliberate consumption of poison rather than from murder imposed upon the village of Thornfield, a peculiar form of emotional devastation that seemed in certain respects more profound than the shock that had initially accompanied the discovery of her body. Murder, after all, possessed the virtue of clarity. It designated a perpetrator, established a motive, and identified a victim who had been wronged through another's deliberate action. Suicide, by contrast, raised questions of considerably greater psychological and moral complexity. It demanded that those who had known Victoria examine their own interactions with her and ask themselves whether they had failed to perceive signs of the despair that had apparently driven her to such an irreversible conclusion. Inspector Cullen, displaying the sort of bureaucratic efficiency that characterized his approach to all matters, attempted to manage the situation through the application of official procedure. He prepared a formal statement indicating that Victoria Ashford's death had resulted from self-administered poisoning, that no evidence of criminal activity had been discovered, and that the matter would be concluded as a coroner's case rather than pursued as a homicide investigation. The statement was released to the village through the customary channels of official communication, and it was received by the assembled residents of Thornfield with a mixture of relief that a criminal had not been responsible for the young woman's death and a profound unease regarding the implications of her apparent suicide. Miss Marple, however, found herself unable to accept the tidy conclusion that official investigation had reached. The discovery of the poison vial explained how Victoria had died, but it did not adequately explain why she had chosen such a course of action, nor did it address certain aspects of the case that continued to trouble her in ways that she found difficult to articulate. She had begun to notice inconsistencies in the various accounts that had been provided by the persons present at the garden party on the afternoon of Victoria's death. Inconsistencies that seemed minor when examined individually, but that assumed considerable significance when considered collectively. It was therefore with a sense of purposeful intention that Miss Marple requested another audience with David Carlyle, the young man who had been engaged to Victoria and who had been among the primary suspects during the early phases of the police investigation. She encountered him at the village green on an afternoon when he appeared to be engaged in the melancholy task of simply wandering without particular destination. The comportment of a man attempting to process grief through physical activity. Miss Marple invited him to sit with her on a bench beneath an ancient oak tree, and she began the conversation not with direct accusations or demands for information, but rather with a series of apparently innocent observations regarding his courtship with Victoria and the nature of their relationship. She commented, with the appearance of casual interest, upon how fortunate he must feel to have been engaged to a young woman of such evident accomplishment and sensitivity. She noted that Victoria's musical abilities alone would have rendered her remarkable, and that her apparent interest in matters of social significance and moral concern suggested a depth of character that would have made her a particularly suitable partner for a young man of serious disposition. David, who seemed initially uncertain regarding the purpose of Miss Marple's observations, gradually began to respond to her gentle questioning. He admitted, with evident emotion, that he had indeed valued Victoria considerably more deeply than his occasional expressions of affection might have suggested to external observers. He had recognized, he indicated, that Victoria possessed a quality of emotional intensity that rendered her simultaneously more vulnerable and more admirable than the ordinary young women of his acquaintance. He explained that Victoria had begun to withdraw from him approximately 2 months prior, and that he had attributed this withdrawal to the ordinary complications of courtship rather than to anything of greater consequence. She had become distracted, had seemed preoccupied with matters that she was unwilling to discuss, and had begun to express doubts regarding the wisdom of their engagement in a manner that had initially wounded him, but that he had gradually come to understand reflected her own internal struggles rather than any deficiency in her feelings toward him. It was at this point in their conversation that Miss Marple asked David a question that seemed to catch him entirely unprepared. She inquired whether Victoria had ever confided to him regarding her concerns about Mr. Whitmore's situation and his illegitimate daughter. David's reaction was immediate and startled. He acknowledged that Victoria had indeed mentioned the matter to him approximately 6 weeks prior, and that she had expressed considerable emotional distress regarding what she perceived as Mr. Whitmore's moral failing in refusing to acknowledge his daughter. However, David indicated that he had been somewhat puzzled by the intensity of Victoria's concern, as the matter seemed to him to be essentially a private affair involving only Mr. Whitmore and the affected individuals. He had suggested to Victoria that while her humanitarian concerns were admirable, she should perhaps refrain from involving herself in circumstances that were not properly her concern. Victoria had responded to this suggestion, he recalled, with a vehemence that had surprised him. She had indicated that such reasoning constituted precisely the sort of complacency and moral evasion that had permitted injustice to flourish throughout society. She had declared that she could not simply ignore wrongdoing when she possessed knowledge of it and had the capacity to advocate for correction. It was following this conversation, David indicated, that Victoria had become increasingly distant from him. Miss Marple, having heard this account, found herself beginning to perceive the outlines of a narrative considerably more intricate than even her previous conclusions had suggested. She asked David whether Victoria had ever indicated that she was contemplating some form of dramatic action regarding Mr. Whitmore's situation. David hesitated before responding, and Miss Marple perceived in that hesitation the operation of a conscience that was uncertain whether to maintain confidentiality regarding a departed friend or to provide information that might illuminate the circumstances of her death. Finally, David acknowledged that Victoria had indeed mentioned, approximately 3 weeks prior to her death, that she intended to take a step that would force Mr. Whitmore to confront the consequences of his actions. When David had asked her to clarify what she meant, Victoria had simply indicated that she would understand soon enough, and that he would likely disapprove of her methods, but that she could no longer tolerate the continuation of injustice. It was at this revelation that Miss Marple felt the true nature of Victoria's tragedy begin to crystallize in her consciousness. The understanding that had begun to form in Miss Marple's consciousness as she listened to David Carlyle's account of his final conversations with Victoria seemed to her to possess the quality of a photograph gradually becoming visible as it was developed in chemical solution. The various elements of the case, the letters from Henry Whitmore, Anne Hartwell's disclosure regarding Victoria's advocacy on behalf of Whitmore's illegitimate daughter, the discovery of the arsenic vial, and David's account of Victoria's determination to force some form of dramatic confrontation began to align themselves into a pattern that was simultaneously more comprehensible and more devastating in its implications than the explanation that official investigation had accepted. Miss Marple thanked David for his candor and suggested that he might benefit from engaging in conversation with the vicar regarding his grief, as she had observed that clerical counsel often provided comfort to those struggling with the aftermath of tragic events. She then made her way directly to the manor house, where she requested another audience with Mrs. Ashford. This time, her purpose was not to examine Victoria's physical surroundings, but rather to engage in direct conversation regarding the precise nature of Victoria's emotional state in the weeks preceding her death. Mrs. Ashford, who seemed to have begun to emerge from the initial shock of her daughter's death, and who was therefore in a state of mind conducive to reflection, acknowledged to Miss Marple that Victoria had indeed been profoundly troubled in her final weeks. The young woman had engaged in lengthy conversations with her mother regarding questions of moral responsibility and the obligations that individuals possessed toward one another when confronted with circumstances of injustice or wrongdoing. Victoria had seemed, Mrs. Ashford indicated, to be struggling with some form of internal conflict between her natural inclination toward compassion and her sense that compassion without action constituted a form of complicity in wrongdoing. Miss Marple asked Mrs. Ashford whether Victoria had ever mentioned obtaining arsenic, or whether she had made any comments that might have suggested she was contemplating harm to herself. Mrs. Ashford responded with evident distress that Victoria had made no such comments, and that she had observed no indication that her daughter was engaged in such desperate contemplation. However, she acknowledged that Victoria had seemed increasingly withdrawn, and that there had been several occasions when Mrs. Ashford had observed her daughter weeping without apparent cause. It was only now, Mrs. Ashford indicated with evident anguish, that she recognized these tears as probable manifestations of the internal despair that had ultimately driven Victoria to suicide. Miss Marple, having secured this additional information, made her way to the village registry office, where she engaged in conversation with the clerk responsible for maintaining records of various transactions and registrations. Through careful inquiry, she ascertained that Victoria Ashford had, approximately 1 month prior to her death, engaged in correspondence with a solicitor in London regarding the legal procedures required to establish a trust fund or similar financial arrangement for the benefit of a minor child whose parentage and circumstances she had specified in her communications. The solicitor had provided Victoria with preliminary information regarding the procedures involved. But the matter had apparently been abandoned, as no formal documentation had been completed. This discovery seemed to Miss Marple to provide the crucial missing piece of the narrative puzzle. She returned to her cottage and engaged in a careful examination of the letters that Victoria had received from Henry Whitmore, reading them now with an entirely altered understanding of their significance. The letters, which she had previously interpreted as attempts by Whitmore to convince Victoria to abandon her advocacy on behalf of his daughter, now seemed to her to constitute desperate pleas from a man who had recognized the trajectory of Victoria's intentions, and who had been attempting to dissuade her from pursuing a course of action that he had come to understand would result in catastrophic consequences for himself. The final letter, dated approximately 10 days before Victoria's death, contained language that suddenly presented itself to Miss Marple with terrible clarity. "I beg you, Victoria, to abandon this intention. I understand your moral conviction, but you must recognize that you are not prepared for the consequences that will inevitably follow. There are aspects of this situation that you do not fully comprehend, circumstances that have shaped my actions in ways that you cannot understand. If you reveal what you have discovered, you will destroy not merely my life, but the lives of others who are innocent of wrongdoing. Please, I implore you, reconsider this course. Some truths are too dangerous to be revealed." The implication that Miss Marple had initially failed to recognize suddenly became apparent with startling force. Henry Whitmore had apparently confessed to Victoria something regarding his past, something that extended beyond merely the existence of his illegitimate daughter, and that constituted information of such serious consequence that he had feared the revelation of that information more than he had feared the exposure of his moral failing regarding the young woman he had fathered. Miss Marple found herself contemplating a possibility that seemed to explain everything. Victoria had not simply intended to force acknowledgement of Whitmore's daughter. She had apparently discovered evidence of some far more serious transgression, and she had determined that she would reveal this transgression to her father unless Whitmore agreed to acknowledge his daughter and provide her with legitimate support. Whitmore had recognized that Victoria was genuinely determined to follow through on this threat, and he had realized that he faced a choice between permitting the revelation of whatever crime or serious wrongdoing he had committed, or finding some method to prevent that revelation from occurring. Miss Marple suspected that Whitmore had provided the arsenic to Victoria under the guise of assisting her with some innocuous purpose, and that he had instructed her regarding how to administer it to someone he had suggested was engaged in some wrongful activity. In her idealism and moral conviction, Victoria had apparently accepted the poison without comprehending that she was accepting it for the purpose of her own death, administered in such a manner that it would appear to be suicide, and would thereby eliminate any possibility of her revealing the information that Whitmore had apparently confessed to her. The theory that Miss Marple had constructed regarding the true nature of Victoria's death possessed a terrible coherence that seemed to her to account for every significant detail of the case, yet it remained a theory rather than established fact. The crucial evidence that would transform her hypothesis into certainty lay concealed somewhere in the circumstances of Henry Whitmore's past, and Miss Marple recognized that she could not proceed further without accessing information that lay beyond the ordinary scope of village investigation. She therefore took herself to the telegraph office and sent a carefully composed message to an acquaintance of considerable standing who maintained contacts within official circles in London. The response, which arrived approximately 24 hours later, provided her with the essential confirmation she required. Henry Whitmore had, approximately 15 years prior, been employed as an estate manager for a substantial property in Yorkshire. During the course of his employment, a young woman employed as a governess had become pregnant as a result of his actions. However, the matter had not been handled with the quiet discretion that such circumstances ordinarily received. Rather, investigation by local authorities had revealed that Whitmore had apparently been engaged in a systematic pattern of similar behavior with other vulnerable young women employed in lesser positions at various properties where he had worked. He had come dangerously close to facing formal criminal charges, but the families whose daughters had been affected had apparently reached private settlements with him rather than submit their daughters to the publicity and shame that would have accompanied formal legal proceedings. This history, combined with the fact that Victoria had apparently discovered evidence of it and had threatened its revelation, provided the final piece of the narrative puzzle. Miss Marple requested another meeting with Inspector Cullen, and she presented to him her theory regarding the true circumstances of Victoria's death. She explained that Whitmore had apparently manipulated Victoria into consuming poison by convincing her that she was administering it to someone else, or possibly by employing some other deception that she had not fully understood. The arsenic vial discovered in Victoria's bedroom had likely been placed there by Whitmore subsequent to her death, intended to create the appearance of suicide and thereby ensure that no investigation would proceed in directions that might expose the information she had possessed regarding his past. The inspector, displaying considerable skepticism regarding a theory that seemed to him to depend upon speculation and inference rather than concrete evidence, nonetheless agreed to intensify his investigation into Whitmore's background. Within a matter of days, the constabulary had uncovered sufficient evidence of Whitmore's past behavior to constitute grounds for his apprehension and prosecution should he be located. Simultaneously, new examination of the circumstances surrounding Victoria's death revealed a detail that had been overlooked during the initial investigation. Traces of the same arsenic poison had been discovered on a letter opener in Victoria's possession, suggesting that she had likely obtained the poison under the impression that it was intended for some other purpose before Whitmore had somehow induced her to consume it herself. By the time these developments had occurred, Henry Whitmore had apparently successfully established himself in Paris under an assumed identity, and the likelihood of his extradition to face charges regarding Victoria's death seemed considerably remote. Inspector Cullen, displaying the sort of bureaucratic pragmatism that characterized his approach to unsolved matters, concluded his official investigation and filed his report. However, the truth regarding Victoria's death had been established with sufficient clarity that those who had known her could begin to understand the tragedy that had befallen her. She had not taken her own life in an act of despair, as the official conclusion would have suggested. Rather, she had been murdered by a man who had manipulated her moral conviction and her idealism against her own welfare, converting her greatest strengths into the instruments of her destruction. The village of Thornfield gradually returned to its customary routines, though the events of that summer seemed to have imposed upon the community a permanent alteration in its understanding of human nature. Miss Marple, sitting in her garden on a particularly pleasant afternoon approximately 1 month after Victoria's death, reflected upon the case with the sort of philosophical acceptance that characterized her approach to the mysteries that human behavior frequently presented. She had been asked, on several occasions, whether she did not feel some satisfaction in having unraveled the truth regarding Victoria's death, in having exposed the deception that official investigation had failed to perceive. Miss Marple had responded to these inquiries with her customary gentleness, suggesting that satisfaction seemed to her to be an inappropriate emotion when considering a tragedy such as Victoria's. She had observed, over the course of a long life, that human nature possessed a capacity for both remarkable nobility and considerable darkness. Victoria Ashford had possessed genuine moral conviction and genuine desire to rectify injustice. Henry Whitmore had possessed genuine fear of exposure and genuine willingness to eliminate threats to his preservation. The tragedy lay not in the fact that one had been evil and the other virtuous, but rather in the fact that both had been constrained by circumstances and by their own characters in ways that had made their collision inevitable. As Miss Marple sat in her garden, observing the roses that bloomed there with the same oblivious beauty with which all of nature proceeded without regard to human suffering, she found herself thinking about the letters that Victoria had received from Henry Whitmore, and about the desperate quality that had characterized his attempts to convince her to abandon her course. She thought about how readily Victoria's idealism had been converted into an instrument of her own destruction, and how tragic it seemed that a young woman of such genuine moral conviction had been unable to recognize the danger that she had approached. And she recognized, as she had recognized so many times in her long life, that the greatest mysteries were not those of how crimes were committed, but rather those of why human beings seemed so frequently incapable of achieving the good that they genuinely desired and so frequently accomplished instead the exact opposite of their intentions.